Good evening and welcome to the 2018 Smith Lecture. My name is Peter Caldor, and on behalf of my two colleagues in the Smith Lecture project, Greg Clark and Bill Herdich, a special thank you for coming tonight. We hope that you find tonight very enjoyable and thought-provoking, and hopefully you'll go long into the night thinking about things that our speaker, Arthur Guinness, will share. The Smith Lecture is an annual event that now is in its 18th year, and it draws its inspiration from the late Reverend Bruce Smith. I know that he's fondly remembered by many in this room. For some, he was their teacher at Sydney Grammar. For others, he was a theological lecturer. To some, he was a dear friend, and of course, to some in the room, he was their father and grandfather. We especially welcome members of the Smith family, Dave and Ange, Rob and Claire, and also Andrew and Annette, and Bruce's grandson, Christian. It's lovely that you continue to be able to come and keep up the tradition. Bruce was a very special man whose love of people and of culture and of God were wonderfully intertwined. And it was in conversation with Bruce that the concept of the Smith Lecture was created. Knowing that for many people, the Bible is really not their first point of reflection to think through the big questions of life, we were thinking about how could we create a space, a forum, where it's possible to engage in a meaningful way with some of the deeper questions and introduce, just gently, some of the thoughts that emanate from the Bible. And we hope that this forum serves that purpose. You be the judge. Please give us your feedback, whether you think it fulfills that brief. Let me give you a quick word on how the evening will proceed before I introduce our speaker. You have the opportunity to participate by questions, and the best way to do that, in fact the only way to do that, on the feedback sheet that you've picked up, on the bottom you'll see that there is a mobile phone number. So please send through your questions, and Ken at the back will receive those, and through the magic of technology, he will send them through to me on a tablet, and then I'll be able to pose your questions to Oz when he's finished his address. After question time, Greg Clark, my colleague, will give a vote of thanks, and then we'll conclude in the usual manner with the customary gift that Andrew Smith will present our speaker. So let me introduce our speaker for tonight. The great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the Dublin brewer. Oz was born in China in World War II, where his parents were medical missionaries. He later completed his undergraduate degree at the University of London and his D.Phil in the social sciences from Oriel College in Oxford. Before moving to the United States in 1984, he was a freelance reporter with the BBC. And since then, he's been a guest scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Centre for International Studies, a guest scholar and visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and senior fellow at the Trinity Forum and the East-West Institute in New York. It sounds like quite a mouthful. From 1986 to 1989, Oz served as executive director of the Williamsburg Charter Foundation, a bicentennial celebration of the First Amendment. In this position, he helped to draft the Williamsburg Charter and later the Global Charter of Conscience, which was published at the European Union Parliament in 2012. Oz is well regarded as an author and social critic, and he's regularly invited to often offer a Christian perspective on social and political trends. He has a keen interest in the relevance of Christian thought in the public square. He's spoken at dozens of the world's major universities and spoken widely to political and business conferences on many issues around the world. He's written or edited more than 30 books, and he lives with his wife Jenny in Washington. Tonight, Dr. Guinness will deliver the 2018 Smith Lecture on the topic, Is There a Future for Humanity? Would you please welcome him?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all. It's a tremendous privilege to be here. I confess that when I accepted this and he said the Smith Lecture, Smith is not exactly the rarest name in the English-speaking language, so I didn't realize the significance of it. And when I heard a little more, I realized I'd enjoyed meeting Bruce Smith many, many, many years ago, and it's a particular honor to come to this lecture in his honor. I love the way that people of faith tackle the modern issues, and I think it's incredibly important. One of my favorite stories of Winston Churchill, whom I had the privilege of meeting as a boy, was a time he went to a graduation ceremony in Canada. And the great man loved whiskey and was well known for it. And so they offered him some. It was actually before noon. He didn't typically drink before noon, but he loved whiskey, and so he gladly accepted some. And since he did, they went all the way down the platform party offering them all whiskey, and they all followed the great man and took it. Until he got down to the end of the line, and there was a local bishop, evidently a small man, who drew himself up to his full height and pronounced he would rather commit adultery than drink whiskey. To which Churchill heard this and said, "Oh, I didn't know we were being offered a choice today." I start there because that's often the place that Christians get into when they don't think through things ahead of time. But I must confess, the first rule of public speaking is never apologize. And in some ways, I feel I have to tonight, because I didn't realize when I offered this topic what an august occasion it would be. And I should have offered a much more seasoned talk than the one I was trying to work out. There's a wonderful story of a young couple, and they hadn't been long married, and the wife kept opening her mouth and putting her foot in it. And her husband, somewhat exasperated, said to her, "Darling, why don't you think before you speak?" And she said, "How do I know what I think until I hear what I say?" Now, my sympathy is with the wife. There are times you've got to try out things, and in the comeback from people, you really begin to understand what it is you're trying to say. And I'm probably in that category tonight. You Australians have an understanding of World War I more than most people because of Gallipoli. For many people, the horror and the carnage and the madness of World War I escapes them. And the way it literally shattered the European self-confidence and identity. But if you look at the responses to the madness, you can see two that begin to emerge quite strongly. One that called into question the whole notion of humanity in the light of the madness. Albert Einstein said, for instance, "What a pity we don't live on Mars, so that we'd only have to look at this human folly through a telescope." And many people repeated that sort of remark. Others, though, called for a setting about rebuilding European civilization and its spiritual identity and unity. And there was common talk of the new Tower of Babel. For example, Stefan Zweig, the Austrian Jewish novelist, not well known today, except for those who know the background of the film The Grand Budapest Hotel. Stefan Zweig, who was extremely well known in the 1920s and 30s, wrote a famous little essay, The Tower of Babel, at the end of the war. And he argued that this was a monstrous moment for Europe, his words. But instead of despair, Europe should set about building a new Tower of Babel, a new spiritual identity and unity for Europe. And he called at the end of it on all those whose will and meaning and salvation is to strive against their creator. A new Tower of Babel. I was a student 4 decades later. In 1961, Bertrand Russell, who taught us seminars at London University, published a book, Is There a Future for Humanity? And often we were confronted with a double challenge. Humanity in the early 60s could now see that it was, on the one hand, post-Auschwitz. What did it say of human beings that those who did these monstrous things were the same people as we are? But we were not only post-Auschwitz, we were post-Hiroshima. And of course, the doctrine of nuclear defense was mutually assured destruction. Mad. What did it say of humans that the only defense was quite literally a form of near madness? And there was talk of the atomic clock and the atomic vault. And Russell, who led the campaign for nuclear disarmament, often told us he read 2 novels a week, deliberately to keep his mind off the potential destruction of the human race. Now, here we are 50 years after that. And you can see today that we're not only post-Auschwitz still, and post-Hiroshima still, we are now pre-Singularity. In other words, the exponential acceleration of technology, artificial intelligence, ultra-intelligence, robots, cyborgs, and the talk of post-humanism and transhumanism. In other words, on the verge of the greatest enhancement and transformation of human beings in history. And of course, this raises the question, what is a human being? And is there a future for humanity as we know ourselves? Now, I'm not setting out this evening to set out all the answers, to put it mildly, but just to look at some of the issues and the stakes for humanity in the answer to this question. First of all, though, think of the conflicting claims surrounding talk of humanity and the new Tower of Babel. From one side, we hear soaring aspirations that humans are about to be gods on the earth. That, of course, is at the heart of Stefan Zweig's essay. But you can see it very clearly in the current bestseller by Yuval Harari, Homo Deus. The book's title says it all. The first paragraph says, we're at the dawn of the 3rd millennium, and humanity is waking up. Yes, there were some dream of the last century with remnants of an awful nightmare still drifting across our minds. Something about barbed wire and huge mushroom clouds. Oh, well, he says, that was a bad dream. But now, on this new age for humanity, we have almost solved the 3 horsemen of famine, plague, and war, so that the book is filled with remarks like, sugar is more dangerous than gunpowder today. Coca-Cola poses a far deadlier threat than Al-Qaeda and terrorism. But not only that, he says, we're on the verge of solving even greater problems. The challenge of mortality, and we will soon be immortal. The challenge of happiness, and the challenge of divinity. So he says, we're about to be on the last days of death. We're about to be godlings, gods of planet Earth, and I'm quoting each time, as we upgrade ourselves to Homo Deus. And here he is as a Jewish writer, writing from Jerusalem itself, but as an atheist. And he says in the first opening pages, scientists today can do much better than the Old Testament God. At the same time, if you look around the modern discussion, you can see that there's a decreasing appreciation for the precious individuality of a single human being. And many of our modern ideas are about the collective, the group, the corporate nature of things, with nothing to say of the value of the individual. So in politics, we've seen the emergence of multiculturalism and tribal politics and identity politics and victim politics. And as you look at all those who advocate these things, sometimes for some good reasons, often without, there's almost never a place for the individual over the group. We're all labeled by our race, our gender, our class, regardless of what we each individually are or what we each individually think. Or we move across to the ethicists. And with many people, the dominant ethical discussion is utilitarianism. The greatest good for the greatest number. And again, we're given hypotheticals. You've got 100 people whose lives are at stake. If only you kill one, surely what would you do? And it's always the fate of the one that goes, and the 100 who are saved, the greatest good of the greatest number. Or you can see with the discussion of technology. As Jacques Ellul, the French sociologist, pointed out many years ago, with technology and its imperative and drive, if a thing can be done, it will be done. And if we don't do it, someone else will do it. And you can see in many of the discussions of the world in biogenetics and so on, the sense of the individual or of human and ethical concerns is simply not there. Or we have the current discussion, say, of algorithms. Many of them opaque and very biased, and they've been described as weapons of math destruction. But again and again, you see, as it said, we're not only in a post-truth world, where without truth everything's power, we're increasingly in a post-human rights world, where the dignity of the individual is increasingly lost. Now, you remember the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Yet even today it said that is only a Western idea, and in many parts of the West that wouldn't be passed, and certainly not in the United Nations, because it is essentially unfounded, and many would say naive and utopian. Now, we move wider still in this discussion, and you can see that even when we're talking to the optimists and those who really sound utopian, like Harari, again and again you have premonitions of catastrophe. As with the Tower of Babel and the story of the tower in Genesis 11. They build the tower lest we be scattered. Somehow, even before they set about building it, there were premonitions of what might go wrong. Having rejected what bound them to God, they realized in some dim way that what bound them together was not enough. And so they build this tower as their self-made human integration. And you can see similar things again and again and again. Harari, for all his soaring dreams, admits there's a paradox of knowledge. Many, many years before him, if any of you have read Jorge Luis Borges's Library of Babel, he predicts the world will one day have, and this was written in the 1940s, instant total information of all the knowledge that's ever been in the world. And the result? Madness. And you can see again and again, Harari says, we may become gods on the earth, but, I quote again, the humanist dream is likely to cause its own disintegration. The same technologies that can upgrade humans into gods might also make them irrelevant. Some economists, he said, predict that sooner or later, unenhanced humans will become completely useless. Now, you know that today the greatest inequality in the world is between the rich and the poor. But as people look to the future, they say the deepest inequalities will soon be between the so-called Ns and the so-called Uns, E-N-S, U-N-S. In other words, the enhanced and the unenhanced. And as one ethicist said, we must enhance or die out. But at the heart of all this discussion, for all their soaring boasts, you can see there's a catch-22. Some of them put it like this: the greatest obstacle to the advance of humanity is the human idea that humans have a dignity that is sacred. And yet, on the other hand, that only the view that human dignity is sacred can prevent the drastic dehumanization of humanity. Which is it to be? It's unclear. Many people know the work of Alan Turing, one of the fathers of the computer. One of his colleagues said very simply, when we create, and this is back in the 1940s, when we create the first ultra-intelligent machine, that will be the last invention humans ever need to create. But we better make sure that we built in human values into the ultra-intelligent machine, or it will treat us the way we now treat animals, as something lesser. In other words, humans have always been dwarfed by the universe, but they've had reasons to counterbalance that. Whereas now we're not only being dwarfed by the universe, we're being dehumanized, potentially, by the works of our own minds and hands. And the question is, what will humanity be if such a world comes in? I suggest to you that we at least need to think the significance of human dignity for the West and for humanity. Up till now, the contrast between our Western view of human dignity, coming directly from the Jewish and Christian scriptures, the Bible, has been one of the main contrasts between the West and other religions and other faiths. And you don't find any other religion with a comparable high view of human dignity. But not today. John Gray, a London philosopher who's an atheist who wrote the book Straw Dogs, he says, Christianity's cardinal error is the belief that humans are radically different from other animals. And many would say the same thing. But it's the consequences that matter. Let me, for example, quote Friedrich Nietzsche and a passage that was widely picked up in the 1930s. Nietzsche, as you know, argued that if God was dead, we cannot live as if everything's the same. And he particularly hated what he called the progressive windbags of progressive optimism, which were the English writers like George Eliot, who said God was dead, but we still had morals. No, Nietzsche said, if God's dead, everything on which God was once the source goes too. And here's Nietzsche. The biblical prohibition, thou shalt not kill, is a piece of naivety. Life itself recognizes no solidarity, no equal rights between the healthy and the degenerate parts of an organism. One must excise the latter, or the whole will perish. Sympathy for decadence, equal rights for the ill-constituted, that would be the profoundest immorality. That would be anti-nature itself as morality. And of course, it was passages like that that were picked up in the 1920s and 30s by many English-speaking intellectuals, H.G. Wells and others, Margaret Sanger, who supported not only abortion, but eugenics and sterilization and various things. And of course, that was behind much of the Nazi treatment of the gays and the handicaps. Here's Hitler picking up from Nietzsche. A stronger race will supplant the weaker, since the drive for life will decimate every ridiculous fetter of the so-called humanness of the individual. More recently to our own time, Michel Foucault, Nietzsche's disciple, and the man who argued that everything should be viewed in terms of power, because if truth is dead, all that's operative is power. Man, he said, is an invention of recent date. one that is perhaps nearing its end. And he's referring to man in terms of human dignity. Now, if you think for a minute, a low view of humanity is not exactly irrational. If you look at how humans have behaved towards other humans. Now, the question is, of course, what view of human dignity, and especially of the precious value of every individual, can stand against this, which they see as the blockage, of course. And if there is such a view, is it showing us that humans are special? Or is it, as the critics say, a form of speciesism? Does it show the uniqueness and exceptionalism of human dignity? Or is the reality that humans are really, on the individual level, expendable in terms of this grand march to the future? Now, clearly, as we look at what created our Western view of dignity, it is the gift of the Bible. The Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, and the Christian Bible, the New Testament. The Genesis declaration that humans are created in the image of God has been described as the Magna Carta of humanity. And you can see from the early church that this gave a very different view of man than the one that was common in the Roman Empire. For example, Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, Irenaeus of Lyon, said, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive." Now, where does that view come from? Obviously, from Genesis. And let me just underscore, because many people say, almost as a cliche, of course, men and women are made in the image of God, but without unpacking some of the remarkable ideas that are behind Genesis 1, 2, and 5. Have you ever noticed, for example, that human creation is unique in Genesis in three ways? Only the creation of humans is preceded by a statement of intention. With the rest of creation, it just says, "Let there be," and there was. So we follow what God does, not what he's thinking in advance. But with humanity, it's different. God declares his meaning of humans before he creates them. And meaning is clearly what God intends in the biblical understanding. And you have later a remarkable verse like the call of the prophet Jeremiah, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." And that's the deep understanding that you see in Genesis 1 and 2. Then again, creation in Genesis is not of a species, the human race, it's of a single human being. The animals, the fish, the vegetation are all created as species, but not humanness. The rabbis puzzled over that for a long time and said it is to teach us that the one who destroys one man can be regarded as destroying all men, and that he who saves one man is regarded as he who saves all men. There's a value to each individual human. Rabbi Heschel said more recently, "We do not think that a human being is valuable because he's a member of the human race. Rather, it's the opposite, that the human race is valuable because it's composed of human beings, each created in the image of God." The third thing you see that's unique about humans in creation is that they're created last. And again, there's a huge amount of commentary by the rabbis on this. Is it a tribute to humanity or a caution? As they put it, if humans behave worthily, they can say that all creation preceded them and led to them. But if they behave badly and unworthily, it should be said to humans, even the gnat was created before you. But here's the stunning paradox at the heart of the biblical view of humanity. The uniqueness of the human being lies in a stunning paradox. According to the Bible, we are like the absolutely unlike. Now, if you think for a minute, the idea that humans are created in the image of God is very common. And the critics of the Bible say that. A lot of people say that. But not so fast, because while it's true that that's said of many people and many gods, the fact is the gods of whom the others are speaking are actually humans projected, superhumans. So when humans are created in their image, you've created a kind of vicious circle that is no help to man and humanity at all. But that is not the biblical position. We are created in the image of God, who is absolutely unlike, because he's not a projection. He's not a superhuman. He's not the forces of the universe personified. He is the creator of it all, transcendent, outside, and very, very different. And so you get this stunning paradox. Man is like the absolutely unlike. Man is in the image of God, who has no image and allows no image. And almost every time the word image or likeness is used in the Bible, it's negative and derogatory, what man must not do. God is God, and we are not to make any image, graven or otherwise, in his image. A remarkable statement, but it means at least this. Man is not God, but what is special about man is what we have in common with God, not what is in common with the rest of the earth. A third point about Genesis is that the image of God, as the rabbis have often said, is not so much in man as a particular quality, but rather is man. The tendency down the centuries has been to say, well, of course it's love, or reason, or communication, or freedom, picking out one particular feature or quality of humanity and making that the image of God, whereas the Bible says it's humanity that is the image of God. The image is man, not in man, the whole man and every man. Or, of course, that's the normal way of speaking traditionally, but we mean every man and woman, humanity, and so on. It's not our achievements, not our values, not our talents, but our very being made in the image of God. Interestingly, after creation, the image of God is hardly mentioned in the Bible. Foundational, essential, decisive, and then not underscored. After that, only in terms of the criminality of murder and the dignity of the human body, but hardly ever stressed. And humans never appeal to God on the grounds of their being made in his image. And when creation is finished, it's immediately followed by an extraordinary stress on polarity. Humans are made of the dust of the earth and the breath of life from the Spirit of God. Now we need to think of that too. The rest of creation comes from either the ground or water. The ground being the source of vegetation and life, and water being the common source of life and refreshment. But humans, it says, are made of dust. Dust from the arid desert, abundant and absolutely worthless. But at the same time, we're human, not only because of dust, but the breath of life. God breathed his life into them, and they became a living human being. In other words, humans are the highest of the high and the lowest of the low. The image of God and the dust of the earth. Less than a man, more than a man. And you can see that polarity runs through humility we must always have. So we are dangerously wonderful, especially when we forget the humility that should be ours. Now, all this, of course, flows in for followers of Jesus into the wonder of who Jesus is and the incarnation. We are like him, God, the great unlike. But in the incarnation, as we look at Jesus defenseless in a crib, he, the great unlike, has become like us. And no one, I think, captured it better than the English poet John Donne. He writes, "'Twas much that man was made like God before, but that God should be made like man, much more." One last point I'd point out in terms of the image of God, and that is in the Hebrew prophets you have the notion of the pathos of God. Now you know the Greeks spoke of logos and ethos and pathos. Many Christians and some Jews following the Greeks have been reluctant to speak of the pathos of God. The logos, yes, the word, he said. Ethos, yes, things are right and wrong and just and unjust. But pathos? For the Greeks, God was impassible. He had no emotions. For the Stoics, you had a matter of indifference and being beyond all these human emotions. But as we look at the prophets, Aristotle speaks of the prime mover, the unmoved mover. But what you see, as commentator says in the prophets, is that God is the most moved mover. He grieves, he sorrows, he laments, he's disappointed, he loves, at times he's angry at injustice and oppression. Why? All because injustice is a violation of the humans that he's made in his image. And you can see that these powerful emotions, some essential, like love, some more in response to what we do, like anger and disappointment, are all rooted in the fact that our Lord is a God of passion and concern and commitments. Why? Because people made in the image of God have been violated. He who insults the poor, as the prophet says, blasphemes his maker. And that, of course, is one of the grounds of a Christian and a Jewish view of fighting injustice. Now, clearly, if all that is true, there are immense implications for ethics and for our requirements in human relations. And let me just mention two among many if we had more time. The first is that means, biblically speaking, that there is a preciousness to every single individual human being. We never think only in the collective. We think of individual humans. Here are the Jewish sages. A single life is like the universe. Or another sage. When human beings make many coins in some mint, they all come out alike. God makes human beings in the same image, his image, and they are all different. Here's Rabbi Sachs, the chief rabbi of Britain until recently. The single most important ethical truth about a person is that no one is substitutable for any other. Compare that with utilitarianism. Compare that with multiculturalism and all our ideas today. Here's Rabbi Heschel, great rabbi in America at the time of the civil rights. To meet a human being is a major challenge of mind and heart. I must recall what I normally forget. A person is not just a specimen of species Homo sapiens. He is all humanity in one. And whenever one human is hurt, we are all injured. Now, if you think of this, it's actually very, very remarkable. And you can think of the contrast with this with the discussion, say, of cloning or of designer babies and so on. Here is Rabbi Sachs. every child born of the genetic mix between two parents is unpredictable, like, yet unlike, those who've brought it into being. It is the space we make for otherness that makes love something other than narcissism, and parenthood something other than self-replication. It is this that gives every human child the right to be themselves, to know that they are not productions or reproductions of anybody else, or constructed according to a pre-planned genetic template. We are each in God's image, but in no one else's. In other words, those of us who are Jews and Christians, we take passionately seriously the preciousness of every single individual human being. And clearly, in what's coming, we will have to fight for that and stand for that. The second thing we can see very clearly is the poverty of other ways of seeing human beings, either as higher, which we aren't, or as lower, which we aren't. Here again is Rabbi Heschel, who escaped to America, not realizing he was escaping, just 6 weeks before the Germans captured Poland, and the rest of his family went to Auschwitz. And thinking of the Jewish people in Auschwitz whose skin was made into lampshades and things like that, he later wrote, "It is true. The human being combines a sufficient amount of fat to make 7 cakes of soap, enough to make a medium-sized nail, a sufficient amount of phosphorus to equip 2,000 match heads, enough sulfur to rid ourselves of fleas. But man as such is now far more than the addition of these elements." You read much of the naturalist description of man, and you see what an incredible reductionism and dehumanization it has become. I don't know exactly how it's going to hit Australia or America or Britain, but I suggest to you we have to follow the work of those who are working on these things. One of my friends in Washington is Francis Collins, great scientist who was the head of the Genome Project and so on. He's now the head of the National Institute of Health, and he was just saying to a number of us recently, there are certain things in the NIH we have said no to. Ethically and humanly, we in the United States under this administration will not do. But he said, we know they're being done in China, and they don't have the ethics or the human notion of dignity to stop them. So let me draw this to a conclusion and throw it open to you. In a very odd way, it seemed, as I was reflecting on this, we are seeing history's parody of the question Jesus asked at Caesarea Philippi. You remember he turned to his disciples and said, "Who do men say that I am?" And they answered. And then he said, "But who do you say that I am?" And you remember the famous response of G.K. Chesterton, later C.S. Lewis, to that, in saying that if you look at the evidence of the Gospels and the record of the Gospels, you really have a number of very simple choices. Was he, as Lewis put it, a liar, a lunatic, or that he was who he said he was, Lord and God? In other words, as others have put it, was he bad? Was he mad? Or was he God? And I was musing on the fact, here we are post-Auschwitz. How bad are we? Here we are post-Hiroshima. How mad are we? Here we are pre-Singularity, when Harari and others will say soon, we will be God. Now, our answer, of course, shapes our human societies, and it will certainly shape the world of tomorrow. which means simply that how we see our fellow human beings shapes the way we treat our fellow human beings and how we treat each other. Let me read you one of the most remarkable passages that came out of Auschwitz. Primo Levi was a Jewish atheist who was in Auschwitz and survived. And he survived by volunteering to join a chemical factory, and he was a chemist, eminent one, but he had to pass a test, and he went to his test in front of an engineer whom he called Dr. Engineer Panwitz. And he describes this German officer, a tall, blonde, blue-eyed officer, with a very neat desk and an orderly office. And this is how he describes, and what's famous is the look the officer gave him. When Panwitz finished writing, he raised his eyes and looked at me. And Levi said later, ever afterwards I wanted to meet him again to discuss that look, to really know what was behind it. Then he went on, because the look he gave me was not the way one man looks at another man. If I could fully explain the nature of that look, it was as if through the glass of an aquarium, directed at some creature belonging to a different world, then I would be able to explain the whole Third Reich down to its very core. Everything we thought and said about the Germans took shape in that one look and that one moment. The brain commanding those blue eyes and those well-manicured hands clearly said this in the look. This thing, standing before me, obviously belongs to a species that must be eliminated. But with this particular example, it's worth my making sure that he has nothing we can use before we get rid of him. Can you hear Nietzsche? Can you hear Hitler? Can you hear Margaret Sanger? There's no question that the discussion of sterilization and eugenics and all these things is coming back in again, and Richard Dawkins, no less, says he's a follower of those people. The way we see depends the way we look and the way we treat. Compare that with C.S. Lewis and the famous passage that you know well, which he gave in St. Mary's Church in Oxford in 1941. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you meet may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you might be strongly tempted to worship. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal. And their life to ours is as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals that we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. How do we see them? Our Lord, the woman of the well, the rich young ruler, the leper who thought no one would touch him. He looked on them with compassion. And obviously that goes back to this wonderful biblical view of the dignity of the humans. You see it nowhere expressed better than in Psalm 8. And I finish with this. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have displayed your splendor above the heavens. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands, and you have put all things under his feet. Or take William Shakespeare. What a piece of work is a man. how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, Hamlet says, what is this quintessence of dust? Is there a future for humanity? The future is between those who see the sacred dignity of the individual human and those who think that they will be like gods if they can only enhance and transform. We're not only post-truth today, we are, as I said, post-human rights. Led by the Western world, sadly, and by Western ideals of today, sadly, such as postmodernism and communism, we are striding towards the most dangerous period of the human future. And we, followers of the Jewish and Christian faiths, we are the guardians of the Magna Carta of humanity. May we be worthy of that calling, and may we rise and be up to the challenge of the hour that is coming. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. My Uncle Noel gave me Oz's book, The Dust of Death, when I was in my mid to late teens, and I was coming up with questions I thought no one else had ever considered. I soon worked out that Oz had considered them. And his writings, with his uncanny ability to point out the deep impact that different worldviews have on the answers to these questions, his work there set me on a path of intellectual engagement that I'm still on now. The Smith Lecture too is part of that journey for me and for many here tonight, and we thank Oz for his articulate, forensic and humane analysis of what is changing in our culture with regards to the value of the person. What he wrote about the 1960s and the Dust of Death, which was published in the early 70s, was prescient. Since we're still dealing with the changes that the cultural and technological revolution there brought, both for good and not for good. Some of the discussions changed. We've heard terms tonight like singularity, transhumanism, enhancement. But these changes, Oz has said, are bringing a most important question into focus, one that's been posed down the ages, in the modern age at least, by Nietzsche, the Nazis, science fiction writers, and many today. Are humans special? That profound question of whether humans are sacred or whether as a species we are something particularly glorious. It does feel like science fiction is becoming fact when the major challenge to that question is coming from technologies like artificial intelligence, cloning, robotics, nanotechnology. But Oz has helped us to understand it's not the technologies that are determining our answers to these questions. It's our undergirding philosophy, or our theology even, of human dignity. Human dignity arises from the Bible, Oz posited, a very difficult but essential thing to propose today. And when biblical literacy, at least in Australia, is so low, this means many people are unaware of the well from which they might need to drink in order for their own survival. Oz outlined for us that the Bible gives us a view of the individual as precious, unsubstitutable, a term I loved, and worth fighting for, but also not God. He gets this from what he calls the Magna Carta of humanity, the Bible. So we've been deeply challenged tonight, not least by Oz's humble confidence that in the idea that Jesus is the incarnation of God to us, entering into our experience of life. In that teaching, we have an essential resource to help us think deeply about the threats, the opportunities and the dilemmas of our age. It's been wonderfully stimulating. I think my Uncle Noel was onto something. Please join me in thanking Oz Guinness. I'll also invite Andrew Smith to come up and to give Oz Guinness the traditional Smith Lecture wine.
Oh,
Thank you so much. I'll give him one.
Hope you drink well.
Talking of discrimination.
Given your family lineage, I'm so glad this is not a beer. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
so
very much.
much. Thank you.